Thank you very much, Toby. I'm really delighted and honoured in a way to be here talking about this subject because I'm struck just going around the room at the continued parallels that keep appearing between the situation in the 1930s and 40s, the Holocaust, and some of the issues that refugees are facing today. Of course, they're not the same scenarios, and I wouldn't wish to say that. But just going through the exhibition, you can see, for example, here how the media, media representations, publics, and policy seem to go hand in hand. The language of media. And over on the other side, the ways in which international organisations have been vital in offering support to refugees. So to come to this particular piece of research, it was done in conjunction with an international organisation, France Médias Monde. Which sounds very grand, but in fact it was done with in collaboration with the Audience Research Department and one woman in there, and we sat having coffee one day and said, look, something is happening here with smartphones and refugees. We need to research it. I wasn't funded to do this. It was crowdsource funded, and people, researchers, and both within France Médias Monde and within my networks gave up freely of their time to investigate some of the questions that we were interested in. And it was a piece of action research. We wanted something to come out of it. And so what I'm going to talk to you about today is the journey that we made as researchers following the refugees' journeys and their use of smartphones, and where we're at today. And it's quite an interesting story and an unusual story because, in fact, with my colleague Claire at France Médias Monde, we have managed to move and shake the European Commission a little bit, and I shall tell you more about that later. But just to start off with, our main research questions were very simple. How are refugees using their smartphones? What are the main gaps in information and news provision? We were under the impression, our hypothesis was, that information precarity was part of the so-called crisis. And we can talk more about what we mean by crisis and the whole problem of calling it a refugee crisis, perhaps in the discussion, because, again, that's a term that seems to imply that the problem lies with the refugees and not with the policy. It was our assumption that the UN Convention for Refugees in 1951, that as part of that, it was the responsibility of governments and states to provide accurate, timely, relevant and well-structured information for refugees in order to enable them to find safety and security. And it was our contention when we set out with this piece of research that from our engagements with refugees that this wasn't happening. And of course we're all aware, I mean, this never again, we're in the Wiener Library, never again, and we find ourselves again in a situation where the very dire needs, human needs, a humanitarian crisis not seen since the Second World War. It seemed that many European governments were looking away, closing borders, not providing information. And so we wanted to investigate the situation. And we wanted to ask, how might organisations like the Open University provide free open access resources for refugees, and how might news organisations actually step up to the task of providing not just information for refugees, but with them. Because with social media, there is that potential. Okay, note about using terms. For the purposes of this talk, I'm going to use the term refugees. We all know that there are a bewildering variety of categories, statuses, and problematic terms, but for the sake of the talk, I'm just going to use the term refugee for now. Oh, sorry, I've gone the wrong way. So here we go. So briefly, the talk, I'm going to give you an overview of the research we did. First of all, looking at a simple piece of research we did was a content and discourse analysis based on a LexisNexis research of about 350 articles that we found in English, in the English language news media, simply by searching for smartphones and refugees. I should say that I'm going to skip over an awful lot of the detail, but this is an open access publication, it's online. Just Google mapping refugee media journeys, mapping refugee media journeys, and you'll find the full reports there. Because I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail, for example, about what we found in the content and discourse analysis. We also did, of course, an academic literature review, and that is documented in the report. We did interviews with young Syrian, but also with Iraqi and Afghan refugees in Paris, in London, and in Swansea. I live in Swansea, that's why. And for the last 15 years, I've been involved in the Swansea Bay Asylum Seekers Support Group. So that's where Swansea comes in. We worked with computer scientists as well, who did computational analyses of the Twitter and Facebook, the people that the refugees that we interviewed followed on Twitter and on the Facebook groups that they followed. So I don't know if people are really interested in social network analysis. I've got some examples, but again, if that's something that intrigues you, you'll find more detail in there. The final part of the talk, I'm going to present to you some of the, we did some horizon scanning, we looked at the availability, the huge availability. There are a massive number of apps for refugees, which I'm sure you're probably aware of, but most of them are never looked at or used by refugees, unfortunately. And so I'll talk a little bit more about quick tech fixes. And what we found in this horizon scanning, we came up with a set of best practice principles, which we then used to present to France 24 and the German, Italian and French international broadcasters that they then used to put a bid to the European Commission. Okay, so here we go. The context. I think those of you who are here will already be very familiar with the fact that in by July 2015, the total number of Syrian refugees alone exceeded 4 million, and 1.2 million refugees crossed the Mediterranean. The situation after the EU-Turkey deal appears to have calmed down, people say. But in fact, my volunteering and fieldwork in Lesbos over the summer and following what's going on in Greece would suggest otherwise. There are 61,000 refugees trapped in Greece. And there we can certainly say that information precarity is a big part of the problem, because many of them, they don't know how long they're going to be there. It's very difficult to know what the procedures are. Many of the refugees in the camp where I was volunteering and doing field work have been there for anything between 6 months and 8 months and up to a year. Things are moving a bit more rapidly now, but the situation, although it appears to have calmed down, remains a significant humanitarian crisis, I would say, and I think there are still huge problems about news about refugees. There's an awful lot about them, not a great deal with or for them. The digital passage to Europe. What was so striking about this particular the movement in 2015 was the reliance on smartphones or on mobile phones, which hugely enabled and accelerated and assisted refugees in moving. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but the main point I want to make here is that now the digital infrastructure, and by that I mean the smartphones, the apps, the websites, the Facebook groups, the Twitter accounts, and so on and so forth, all the associated ways in which smartphones are used are part of what we would call the digital infrastructure. And that digital infrastructure is now almost as important as the roads and the railways and the sea crossings that people make. And this is something quite new and something that is worthy of much more detailed investigation. Over the summer, I was also involved all over last year. I don't know if any of you here saw the BBC Two documentary Exodus. Well, we were the academic advisors on that, and you'll remember that, those of you who've seen it, that about 300 refugees from all over the world were given smartphones, and the idea was that they were going to film their own journey. And I have to say that that was one of the most heart and gut-wrenching experiences, seeing the footage coming through on the smartphones and working on that documentary. And I noticed that actually Ahmed al-Rashid, he was one of the main characters in Exodus. But the key point here is that the smartphone is ubiquitous in many of the images that we see in the media. And if you actually do go into more depth into the discourse analysis, we see a big shift from it, first of all, being a refugee essential to, after the Paris attacks in November 2015, being a terrorist essential. And I'm sure you're all aware of that shift that came about. Okay, so how are we supposed to think about the smartphone as a piece of technology, about its power, and about vulnerabilities, the specific vulnerabilities of refugees? Well, first of all, it's a multi-sensory tool, and again, you know, looking around the room, you know, the use of photographs for witnessing the experiences that people have on their journeys is something that the smartphone is very commonly used for. It's multi-sensory and it's multifunctional. One of the key points I'm going to make tonight is that although it's a powerful resource, it's also a dangerous threat for refugees. Let's look at it as a resource first of all. The smartphone camera, very helpful in documenting journeys, in bearing witness. We see the pictures on the walls here, bearing witness. The whole questions around seeing and knowing. These have been vital, you know, in the experiences of refugees across the world. But now, with the smartphone, not only are they taking selfies and images to keep in touch with their families back home, and the ubiquitous selfie upon arrival, the jubilation and the joy, but the smartphone is itself a living, expanding archive, of a photo album of their past life, of the journeys that they've made, and an archive of each stage of the refugees' journeys. And on my smartphone, because I'm now in touch with many people, their archives are my archives. And so I've been able, I could show you, if we have time, some of the images that have been sent about fires in camps and experiences along the way. So there is a question around refugees as citizen journalists. And a bit later on, when I talk to you about the funding bid that the research was used to make, to set up a website for and with refugees, this idea of refugees as citizen journalists, as witnesses to verbal and physical abuses by smugglers, by police, by authorities, that can all be on their smartphone. And that's great in one way, because when you go to claim asylum, you can say, look, here's some evidence of what I've been through. And yet, if the wrong person gets hold of that smartphone, equally you could be dead. So what you find is that multiple SIM cards are used, so that photos can be put on SIM cards and hidden on different parts of the body, especially if it's important. But what we found is that even though refugees are taking pictures of abuses that they themselves have endured or that they have witnessed, they're not passing it on. They're not passing it on to the authorities because they're scared. They're scared because they don't know who to trust. It's very, very difficult to know, if you're a refugee, who to trust. But there are people who do become trustworthy. In solidarity groups, for example, in Greece are flourishing. And one cannot deny that this so-called crisis has generated an enormous amount of human kindness as well as antipathy. So again, we have this kind of profound ambivalence that we're continually navigating and trying to understand. So there's not enough trust and security among refugees to share their testimonies with international news providers. And so when we were making the bid to the European Commission, we were saying, look, not only is there, other governments not providing the right kinds of information that will help refugees, but nor are they able to use social media and become citizen journalists and provide you with user-generated content that might enable them to represent themselves and not always be in the spotlight, the subject, everything being about the deserving or the undeserving refugee. So many of the similarities and parallels we see in the exhibition and what we found in our content analysis and in our interview material. So security and surveillance are big issues. Refugees are trackable and traceable. Every smartphone, your smartphone, I'm sure you're all aware of this, your smartphone contains a huge amount of information about you. I was on the tube this evening and opened up the Evening Standard, and I see that Facebook now have created a further app that you can install that will allow them to gather more data about where you've been in order that they can predict in the future where you'll go. And imagine having data sets like that on a mass scale. So the collection of personal data by terrorist groups, by governments, by traffickers, everyone knows this happens. And for example, when refugees were making in 2015, when there was a massive number of refugees moving, they were using the navigation devices on their GPS on their smartphones, and I mean, police can track the movement of groups going into forests or hiding in little remote villages. So it's dangerous. It's empowering, but it's dangerous. And of course, there's a key vulnerability. Smartphones get lost, damaged, traded, bartered, upgraded, downgraded. And we all know about the smugglers. Those of you who've seen Exodus, for example, will have the BBC Two documentary will have seen how, that's the main way in which most of the refugees who are forced to become illegal, who are forced into becoming criminals in a way, if they're trying to, because there are so few legal routes available to them, then they have to rely on smugglers, and they use Facebook to recruit them, to sell fake passports, and it's important also to realise, of course, that not all refugees have smartphones. About 86 or 90% have phones or have access to a phone, and among Afghans, for example, and some Iraqis and the poorer Syrians, they would, only have a simple mobile phone, but still, absolutely a vital tool. And before they set off on the journey, many of them said, more important than food and water. Smartphone, water, food, in that order. So, go now into a little bit more detail about the interview material. We've been following Syrian, Iraqi, Afghan and Pakistani refugees mainly young, mainly in the some of the unaccompanied minors are as young as 12, and some of the older parents are in their 40s. That's the main age group, and we've interviewed them about how they use media before they leave, during the journey, and upon their arrival in France, mostly in France. We haven't done so much interviewing of late in Britain. So here we did a lot of our interviewing in Port-Saint-Ouen, where refugees were living on the streets. We also interviewed refugees who were living in sheltered accommodation. And before leaving, three main issues came up: news and truth, power and trust. So I'm referring now mainly to the Syrian data. And in Syria, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of channels, but they're not trusted. We have to realise that not just, in the Middle East, there are so many different channels, and because usually they're paid for by, they're either the state or paid for by political factions, not so different to us, that they all seem to have a slant. Information sources were abundant. We have more than 600 channels, this is a quote, in Syria. But we were living the events. We used to watch France 24 in Arabic too, although there are a lot of channels, but they only cover 10% of what's happening. To tell you the truth, all news channels are politicised. We are the witnesses. We are present in the field. We refugees know more than journalists. So there was a great sense in which if you want to find out the truth, you have to piece it together for yourself from multiple sources. Power. A big issue in using both, in accessing information and news. Electricity cuts, especially in the Islamic State zones, mean that there's very, very limited access to TV news and the internet. So another quote, I wasn't able to communicate with my family. Internet access is cut there and the phone is cut. So I'm giving you quotes that were repeated, that formed a pattern in response. And trust. Who do you trust when you've got 500? You know, who do any of you trust? Where do you find your news and your information? Well, increasingly we're all grabbing it from here, there and everywhere and via trusted intermediaries. But the most reliable and truthful news and info for refugees comes via the trusted intermediaries, and they are the family and friends in Syria and in the diaspora, from activists, the Syrian the observatory, for example, or activists, journalists, people who get a reputation for being a refugee supporter, investigative reporters, but only those that are close to the ground. And even smugglers. A lot of people think, smugglers are all bad, nasty criminals, and of course many of them are. But if you're desperate and trying to get out of a place, sometimes they are your route to freedom. And the fact that many people have made it, many have died, of course. But there are smugglers who are trusted and they provide information, sometimes false, sometimes misinformation. But also there are people who are not necessarily part of a transnational criminal network, but who are taxi drivers who try and help people, you know, and they're smugglers too. Anyway, we can talk about that after, but quote, we believe ourselves, we believe what we're seeing, what we receive from our parents, from friends, and those we trust. We can consult Facebook's pages because they're more active on the ground and they represent what's happening, unlike some reporters who are hiding in the hotel and waiting to receive information from news agencies and other sources. So, moving on to en route, we've already touched on some of the uses. Staying in touch with relatives. Hugely important, staying in touch with the pioneer refugees who've made the journey and gone ahead of them. Getting passage tips like, make sure you dress smart, wear hair gel when you cross the border. Tips like this are passed on. And of course with smugglers and coast guards. Another quote, we kept in touch with smugglers on the road. You speak to the person who left before you. My brother left a week before me. I followed his steps through WhatsApp and Messenger. I mainly use Messenger. I lost WhatsApp. So people are following the others' journeys. They're following the experiences, the obstacles, the easier routes, the less dangerous routes. And so this kind of constantly staying connected, very funny shape on that SIM card, isn't it? So it's important for staying mobile, for locatability. In the academic jargon, we talk about the affordances of locatability, of communication, and multimediality. But basically that means staying mobile, finding out where you are and navigating where you want to get to, and staying connected. 13 SIM cards, one young Syrian boy told me. He said, that's how we arrived here, because you have to buy a SIM card, a new SIM card in every country. And of course, that's a trade too. And you can get sorely ripped off in the trade in SIM cards. This map was given to us by a young Syrian lad, and he said, hasn't anyone shown you this map? He said, it's essential, it's indispensable. And it was passed on by hundreds and hundreds of refugees, mainly on WhatsApp. And WhatsApp is among the most trusted, or at least it was until now. There are some security issues that some of you may be aware of. The most trusted because it's more secure. You're not. It's not easy to gather data about you, although that's changing. And what you can see here is in Arabic. Okay, it says the road to Germany, and the cost $2,400. And the person who's created this has taken some time to design it. The nice little icons, and you can see it's both in Arabic and in Greek and in English, because it's important to be able to see the Greek. So you can see that you start off by a car in Izmir in Turkey, and then you take the boat to Greece, to one of the islands. Okay, and it gives you the price. The boat's $950 to $1,200. And then you take another boat to one of the islands and a train. The train is to the mainland then, to Thessalonica. That's Thessaloniki. And then 45 euros will get you into Macedonia, but you get a train for some of the way, and then you have a very, very long walk through fields and forests, and quite difficult. Macedonia, and then you walk across the border, and then 10 euros by train, and you get to Serbia, 20 euros, and you can get a bus, and you go through Hungary, and then you need to get from Hungary to Germany. You need to get you get two cabs, 125 euros and 500 euros, and then yay, you're in Germany. And somebody has obviously printed this out, drawn two little stick men, hooray, and they've arrived. So this is the kind of thing that is passed on, or was very commonly passed on. And of course, phones help tackle obstacles during the journey. Information and connections can help overcome some humanitarian problems. One woman told us that she'd been pregnant and her waters had broken, and so she was just about to cross the Serbian border, and her husband managed to use the translation tool on her phone and say, look, my wife desperately needs a hospital urgently. And they were able to actually speak a few words, and this helped to humanize the situation, and she got medical help and had her baby safely. So also, if you get stuck, as many people did, over 3,000 people in 2015 lost their lives at sea, crossing the Mediterranean. You can call the Coast Guards, and if you don't have a phone and you haven't got a Coast Guard number, then that's when you're likely to die, basically. And talking about information precarity, that is one of the situations or communication precarity, one of the situations where refugees are most vulnerable is if they don't have a phone, and if they can't communicate, if they can't use the tools. And that is what has been found by other researchers to be the scenarios when most refugees do die. So also it's just about know-how. One guy told us, I wanted to have my fingerprints taken in Austria because you know where you get registered and have your fingerprints taken, that's where you then claim asylum. So a lot of refugees are trying to avoid getting their fingerprints taken, say in Greece, because they want to move on and get to Germany or somewhere else where they have family or they know that they may be supported. So I wanted to have my fingerprints taken in Austria, but someone told me on WhatsApp, it's no good there. Then I decided to go to Germany because it helps. It helped refugees. So people, their journeys are not straightforward. They don't sort of leave Syria and get to Germany, you know, and the map makes it look a little bit like that. But many people are crisscrossing back and forth. They may go from one island to the other. They may get sent back. They may go underground. Journeys are very, very, very complicated. And also on the journey, there are many technical problems. €5 to charge your phone in Macedonia. Also, another guy told us, I bought numbers, a number that was supposed to be international from Greece and that would allow me to reach Germany. They lied. Once we reached the next country, it stopped working. So we looked for Wi-Fi. Where there was Wi-Fi. So finding somewhere to charge your phone, finding Wi-Fi, staying connected, and the vulnerability of connections causes a lot of problems, because if you're trying to connect with your smuggler and you run out of power, or your phone gets wet, or you haven't got Wi-Fi, imagine you're paying vast amounts of money or your family is paying a huge amount of money for them to get you to Europe, get you to safety, and everything falls apart because you haven't got a Wi-Fi connection or your phone loses power, you know. So technical problems lead to information problems. We didn't have Wi-Fi for 2 or 3 days and we were very, very stressed. People then feel disconnected. And then on arrival, I think this will be much more familiar with you. There's an information and translation void. There's a real need for more legal, medical information about social services, where people can go to learn languages, how to shop, how to travel. And again, around the room, in the exhibition, you're struck by some of the very fundamental similarities that all refugees undergo, despite the differing political contexts. Language is the most important thing if you need to move. We need everything. We're reborn now. We want to know everything on this country. We want studies, work, driving license, transportation card. We need to know everything. Metro, buses, tourist places. This is the dream. You know, if you have struggled to get somewhere, and then when you arrive, you want to live your dream of security and resume a kind of normal life and become normal. But we did quite a bit of interviewing with asylum seekers in Paris, and they felt disappointed and abandoned. And this was largely because of the misinformation that was circulated on social media by smugglers, and even by people who allegedly were talking on behalf of governments. For example, they told me that within 3 months I'd be able to bring my family. That was the most important thing for me, that the salary was €600 a week. That I'd get a resident permit for 10 years and a place to stay. So I decided to go to France, but none of that was true. And of course, one of the key themes that we identified in the discourse analysis of news media is that there is this image of the smartphone. The Irish Times referred to the smartphone-wielding refugees you know, who they're all rich, they're not real refugees. How could they be real refugees if they can afford smartphones? You know, so the kinds of inherent assumptions. And then the other big theme, one of the other big themes was about how through the smugglers, people have wildly distorted views of what Europe is and what it's like. And so when they get here, things aren't what they may have thought. Okay, I'm going to skip some stuff now because I'm going to move very quickly through the so that we've got plenty of time for discussion. But I want to just show you that some of the analysis that we did with computer scientists on Twitter and Facebook, and this was mainly a social network analysis. And here are some of the findings. We found, again, and this confirmed what we discovered in the interviews, that they're following influential figures, activists, NGOs, and journalists. There's a very deep suspicion, and this is behaviour online that we found by going and doing a computational sort of social network analysis of all the Facebook groups and Twitter people that were followed. So there's a great suspicion of official, national and state-funded institutions, social media and the internet, because they're always on the periphery of the social networks, and I'll show you that in a minute. And there's a mistrust of Western individuals and organisations online. In actual fact, refugees make very limited direct use of international news sources. It's mainly coming through friends, family and trusted intermediaries. And these fears of surveillance and surveillance mean that when they are online, they use avatars and pseudonyms, or they keep changing their identities, their Facebook pages, slight variation of names and different kinds of pictures. But when confident about feeling that they're anonymous and that they're on a private discussion group, refugees express their political views without restraint. And we did find here that obviously political emotion is very, very high, and that's to be expected. But that there is kind of ideological insularity, that people, like us all, we go online, and we tend to go online to groups that we trust or that confirm our view of the world. I won't go into the detail. It's far too annoying to try and difficult to explain the detail of this. I'll just give you the broad outline is here. This is a Facebook group, and we can see that during the period analysed, the main, football is discussed, that's on the outside. A Syria inventor wins an awards, that's a nice big cluster of conversation. Turkish convoy for Syrians. The main issues that are discussed are a huge outpouring of rage, of political rage, at Russian bombings, for example, that during the period that we looked at. The Syrian Observatory of Human Rights, they are a group based in London, and they have people on the ground, and they're I think the main point here, rather than try and give you too much detail, which you won't probably take in, and if you want the detail, you can read the report. The main point is that you can track the kinds of conversations. Now, this was a research project that didn't have very much funding. We were doing it in our spare time. We got together and we were able to actually track through widely and open accessible sources who was talking to, I mean, not necessarily to the point of drilling down individuals, but what the topics were, who was talking to who were the most influential figures being followed. And you think that if we can do that, imagine what the security services can do. Anyway, moving on to the final bit, which is about the horizon scanning that I mentioned at the start, because part of this research was not just for our own academic purposes, but also to try and put together a bid to the European Commission to actually sit up and do something and not look away, and get international news media to take responsibility and provide safe and secure platforms. So these were some of the principles that, after looking at a whole number of different studies, that anybody trying to provide digital resources with and for refugees, first of all, you have to do it with refugees. It has to be user-centred, and that's where groups like Tech-fugees have gone slightly wrong, because they're very excited, these kind of techno-optimism and techno-solutionism, that apps can somehow solve the problem, but they can't really. I mean, they can support and they can help, but it's really only policy and politics that can. They have to be secure and private. They have to be trusted and credible. The information has to be checked, curated and collaborated. We found and studied a number of sources that they weren't regularly updated, and actually that can do more harm than good, especially if you're providing legal information, because the laws in different countries are very varied in Europe, and they're changing. Things change, and if you produce a digital resource and you don't keep it up to date, then that can do more harm than good. It should add value to what's already there. It should be free and accessible. Above all, it should be sustainable in the sense that refugees are using it, they're finding it useful and relevant, and it should be sustainable in that there's enough money and enough resources to do all the checking, curating and collaborating, and that the aims and objectives of the digital resources with and for refugees should be aligned with the strategic aims of the organisation. And here we're talking about France Media Monde, Deutsche Welle and ANSA, which is the Italian news feed. There's an interesting tale about why the Brits are not involved. If anyone wants to know about that, we can discuss that later. I'm not going to go into the details, but these are some of the apps available. This is probably the best top-down one by Google. Sustainable, go-to resource. It's part of a collaborative creation. It's localised and accessible information on 10 specific areas in Greece where refugees live. It's open source and optimised for mobile phone. But its development is in transition. There are gaps and inaccuracies in the information, particularly legal information. It's top-down, Google. It doesn't involve refugees at its centre. And its translation services, although widely used, I don't know if you've ever tried using the Arabic translation services, but if you're relying on them, it's pretty gobbledygook. Info mobile, welcome to Europe. I'll skip through this one because I wanted to talk about, and I'm coming to the end now, but this was the Lesbos Solidarity Group. I thought was a very interesting example of a grassroots local solidarity support group that was able to reach out transnationally through its army of volunteers and create what you might call, for those of you who like academic jargon, transnational digital solidarities. And it was amazing because this particular camp is, this is where I was over the summer doing field work and also volunteering. It doesn't accept any government funding. It's based solely on volunteers. And it's amazing because the website, if you look up, there's a Facebook group, Lesbos Solidarity, you can look up its website, and anybody can go and volunteer. And I mean, the number of people who are going, and through a kind of snowballing effect, who are supporting refugees there is very heartwarming, and it is actually an amazing camp. And the people who are there are a core group of people running it, and the key person, Effie, she won the Nansen Award. I don't know if you're familiar with the Nansen Award, but it's he was a Norwegian, and it's for work that supports human rights. And they do an amazing job. It's the camp in Lesbos that takes the most vulnerable refugees. There are two other camps, Moria, which is really like, I don't know if I dare say it, but it is almost like a concentration camp. It is, if you look up Moria camp, Google it. This week, on my Facebook page, not that I want anyone to follow me, but I've posted some pictures that one of my friends, who's a photographer, he's a Norwegian photographer, he's been there for the last 6 weeks. And people are living in tents in the freezing cold with snow. I mean, you must have heard the reports coming from Greece about the conditions in which refugees are being kept. I mean, it's astonishing that the other European countries seem to be turning a blind eye to this situation of 61,000. Many of them unaccompanied minors. Every day I get messages, help me, send me money, I haven't got a coat, we have no food, we're living in the street. The camp, a month or so ago, the camp Moria was burnt down. And then PICPA had to take all the unaccompanied minors. It's a big story, too much of a story to go into now. But the interesting thing is that it is the other side of the crisis. And it is the human side that actually does inspire one with hope. That people do give up their lives. They do, albeit, some of them are youngsters who are looking for a nice, I did overseas volunteering and it looks good on my CV. But still, the experience transforms people. And it's open access. Whether or not the model is adaptable, there are camps like that all over Greece. And the Greek people who are already highly politicized, and on Lesbos there is a big history of population exchanges between Turkey and Greece. So many of them, their grandparents, were refugees. And I'm writing about that at the moment. But is it sustainable? Well, yes, it is, and it is sustainable because the people who go there and they open their minds and they actually engage really with refugees and they support and help them. When they go back through the digital solidarities, the networks, we raise funds, and you become part of something that is a little drop in the ocean. So maybe I should just leave it there, and maybe we can open up some questions. And I would like to at some point tell you a little bit about the recent developments, because I've just come back from Paris and France Média Monde, and before we finish, at some point, if you want to hear about this new resource that will be launched in Feb.
Excellent, thank you. Well, in that case, I'd like to open the floor for questions. And yes, we'll start with this gentleman here.
Yeah.
2 questions. One, the computational analysis that you talked about social media. I was wondering how you went about identifying who were refugees. And also, do you know of any instances where refugees' phones were used by
What? Sorry, I didn't quite catch the second question. Do I know any examples of?
Smartphones being monitored, or refugee smartphones being monitored, some sort of surveillance.
Oh, definitely. Well, on the first, let's do the first question. You can't really identify a refugee online, but because they don't say, "Hi, I'm a refugee." So you're quite right. It's a very astute question. But what we did was in the interviews and the conversations we had, we sat with refugees and we listed all the Facebook groups that they were using and the Twitter accounts that they were following, and so those were the groups. But we cannot be sure, of course, that all the people on through the computational analysis are refugees. You can't know that, so that is an issue. But one has to assume that, given the content, that a large majority of them are. And when you look at the discussions, that then would reflect the experiences of refugees.
Just on a more granular level, how would you even compile the groups to look into? Is this just the work you've been doing, or?
Well, that's what the computer scientists do. What we do is we give them the lists of the Facebook groups and the Twitter accounts, and they have these tools, which I would not be capable of explaining, but it is explained in the report. And what they do is that they gather big data, because there are tools for scraping the Facebook pages and the comments and all that, and then they put it through a social network analysis, and they come out with these pretty gorgeous looking diagrams, but actually you can't get to a level of granularity at them very easily.
And then there was the second question about surveillance.
The second question, well, I mean, I think it's, I can't point to any one specific example, but I mean, the state and the Google and companies are constantly undertaking surveillance exercises on such groups. The Syrian Observatory. I mean, that's how they create their lists of suspects. Going online. I mean, people. For example, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, MI5, MI6, there are armies of people who infiltrate groups.
I was just interested in whether any of it was actually in the public domain.
I'm not sure about that, but I could look into it if you really were interested.
And one of the issues that's, sorry, I will come to you in a second. I was just on that point. It seems like an interesting issue, the relationship between private data and public data, and also official data, because the kind of data that state bodies may gather is not necessarily reflected in official statistics.
Yes.
And so the whole question of how big data is changing the way we perceive reality and what is officially true and what is kind of evolving very rapidly, isn't it? So that the role that the state plays in this is perhaps changing all the time. It's changing all the time, and we do know that the authorities in the different countries have used the GPS, as I was saying, to follow groups. But I mean, I'm not
I'm not part of the security services, so I don't quite know how they do it, but I'm sure there are people who are investigating that.
Yeah. The question here.
Follow up, I give you this, but I'm not trying to justify, of course, any data collection mechanism, etc. But don't you think that those security mechanisms are getting alarmed exactly because in some cases the users are changing their Facebook profiles, they use pseudonyms, avatars, etc. So in a way they are getting very attractive. So they can be used quite easily as case studies.
And so what is getting attractive? Data
collection can be justified more easily, exactly, because there are people who change their profiles quite often. So they're becoming suspects in a way.
Oh, I see.
They use pseudonyms, etc., etc. So even if you go back to the EU legislation about privacy and data collection, this is exactly what they start with. The security mechanisms are getting alarmed when such actions take place, like changing the profile quite easily.
Yeah, but that's what makes refugees a very difficult group to research and to track. But lest we think that, there are some very useful uses of big data gathering. UNHCR, I was at one of the big conferences last year on digital data, and as an organisation, they're in paralysis. They don't know what to do, whether they should be. A part of the organisation wants to get out there and find out more, because then it enables more effective service provision if they understand. So, for example, in places where, like Turkey and Lebanon and Jordan, where there are a lot of Syrian refugees, now most of them are not in camps. They've gone into urban centres. So it's very difficult to locate them, find them, support them, and especially children. The benefits and the risks are just frighteningly difficult to kind of really balance out, because so many young refugee kids are disappearing, and their organs are being sold. They're being murdered, and organs are being sold. I joke not. And the trafficking of young, of young, and a lot of that is dependent and reliant on digital networks. I'm not saying it's a causal, but it's part of that criminal network and part of the vulnerabilities that are experienced.
Going to take another question?
Yeah,
here at the front.
Thank you, by the way. I was wondering, could you expand a little bit on when you said that really only policy and politics can solve the problems, not these apps? And can you expand a little bit on how policymakers can interact with technology in order to solve these problems? What your specific bid to the EU was?
Oh yeah. Well, I don't think that the bid is not going to change the world or solve the problem. To solve these problems requires a political will that seems to be beyond most politicians, sadly, at the moment. But and the fundamental causes are always the same, aren't they? They're about inequality and poverty and lack of opportunity and injustice and violence, and until you can tackle the root causes of the problems that cause the war. Caused the wars in Syria. We are Britain. We're selling arms, aren't we? We're involved in the arms trade. And we think we've got clean hands. We haven't. But okay. So what can So I do think that really the problems that are being faced by refugees need to be resolved by a political will, by more humane policies, and I think the policy inertia has been staggering. And when I was doing this research and moving around the UNHCR, I was talking about their paralysis, and I was at the European Commission with the bid and all this, doing presentations, and everywhere I went was the same. We've got our hands tied behind our back, they all say. And I said, why? Because we cannot be seen to be facilitating the refugee migration to Europe, because it's too much of a political, it's too politicized, and we can't. They're scared. The European Commission, no, and same with the France Média Monde, same with the BBC. The Exodus programme is a very good example. And now I'm telling you some secrets, which don't tell too many people, but that documentary series should have gone out before the referendum, and the BBC stopped it going out because it was seen by the hierarchy, the top echelons at the BBC, that it would be promoting a positive attitude toward refugees and migration. And that is, I don't have it in writing, but I know it for a fact. So when did it go out? In July. It was July, wasn't it? When everyone was on holiday. Hardly anyone saw it. And then I think it was rebroadcast in the midnight slot. So, challenging media representations is difficult. The politicians are running scared because they have seen the rise of populist politics, and they don't want to upset the electorate, and they don't want to... what is Brexit about? I mean, I know it's about many, many, many things, but I mean, it is also very much about control of our borders. It's very much about deciding who we in Britain want to take in. So, to answer your question about, that's where the policy and the politics must come in. But having said that, I am someone who believes in the power of human kindness and solidarity, and I've seen it. I've witnessed so many acts of kindness to refugees, to homeless, to people, and I think that we have to somehow or other build on that and build. And I think that the project that we've done, they got the funding. It's not I didn't make the bids. The France Média Monde did, but it was very difficult internally, because even internally within no organisation is homogenous, and some people said, "What? France Média Monde is going to produce a website, Info Migrants? What's this? We're news providers. We're not here to provide news for refugees. This is outrageous." It was very, very political. It was very political, even dealing with the European Commission, and the European Commission are not sending out the contract just yet. We don't even know whether they're going to wait till after the French elections. That's in April. But they certainly, France Média Monde, are not going to do a big launch until after the elections. These things matter. But the idea is, it's called Info Migrants, infomigrants.net. It will be launched quietly, discreetly, so that it doesn't upset anybody. And it is hoped that slowly, it will evolve organically. And I will be very interested to see whether or not they honour the commitments to all the principles of best practice that we were drumming into them through the process of the application. Let us see. But look out for us in February.
Should we take one more question? At the back, yes?
Yeah.
I was just wondering about families and being connected, and where do migrants sort of lose connection with their family and how they reconnect? did you get to see kind of any trends between the nationalities? Do Afghans lose connection with their family much quicker than Syrians, or do they not lose connection at all with their family around the world?
Well, it varies a lot, but what I saw, I didn't see many people losing connections with their families. In fact, I spoke to quite a few mothers who, you know, their sons would say, "Oh, say, here's Maria, she's my friend, speak to her, here's my mother." And I mean, the way in which families are able to stay, transnational families, able to stay together. I mean, if you're in ISIL areas, yes. I mean, there's one of my friends his family's in Idlib, so they're, you know, now they're parts there that are ISIL controlled, and they're, you know, it is very dodgy, and then it's precarious. People are very anxious, very stressed, losing touch with family, and it is, of course, a terrible wrench, not knowing whether your family is still safe. But usually there's a way. Nowadays, somehow, somewhere, somebody has access to a mobile phone, and eventually you get there. And that's a big difference, isn't it, to the 1930s, where people relied on letters.
Well, I was actually wondering about if the family was sharing a device.
Oh, yes.
What are the dynamics of that?
Oh, very difficult. Very, very difficult. I mean,
scarce resource, isn't it? The battery.
Yeah, I mean, there were families in Pikpa where, of course, the father had it most of the time. The younger kids were always trying to steal it from him to play games. Computer games are huge. Clash of the Clans, for example. I mean, if you're a refugee, you've got loads of time and not very much to do. And I mean, it was on the news this morning how in Turkey something like 60% are not in school. So these great games, you know, people are. I mean, Mohammed, who's in Pikpa with his mum and his two brothers. He keeps the phone all the time, and he's on the game all the time. Now, his mum's a poet, and one of the things we're trying to do, apart from doing we did a photo exhibition using smartphones and photos, and the kids took the pictures, and they write up. We get them to do poetry so we're using the smartphone as like a creative tool. Collaborative creative tool, hosting little mini exhibitions using a washing line and pegs. And so I'm trying to get his mum, Hoda, she writes this lovely love poetry. They're separated from the father, and I never quite understood. This is maybe an example for you. We don't know whether they're in touch much with the father, but he went to Germany, and he's Syrian, she's Lebanese, and she's got 3 sons, but they were all born in Lebanon. So she's been stuck in Pikpa for over a year. Now they are a separated family. And there are other examples now that are coming to mind, separated families where sometimes the father will go with the children, and the mother remains, say, in a camp in Jordan or Lebanon, because then it's easier for the mother to join in principle. But in practice, the family reunions, you know, can take a long time and be more precarious.
Should we take another question? Yes, over here on the right.
I was just wondering about the role of digital in empowering refugees. So the UN has released a prototype or now something about actually linking people that need documents translated with refugees that have translation skills to give them some work and some empowerment. And I was wondering kind of what else is going on. Like, is there anything else going on in that space in terms of not just giving information to refugees, but actually providing them with work or with ways to use their skills?
Yeah, I think there's a lot going on in that. I mean, for example, there's a translators across borders. That's a crowdsourced. It uses mobile technology to, use. You can instantly get a translator for example. There's psychiatric support digitally. Some of it is documented in the Lit Review chapter and in the section on digital care. You can find some references to support. But oh yes, I did bring an object. And this is at Pikpa Camp. One of the things about sustainability is because now so many people are actually going to end up living in Greece because it's very difficult for them to go elsewhere. At Pikpa, last year they started this workshop that makes these rather fashionable bags out of life jackets. Now, again, such ambivalence. I mean, this is the material that a refugee made the crossing in. It was discarded on the beach in Lesbos. There are mountains. There are millions of refugee jackets in a waste heap, dump, municipal dump in Lesbos. And eco groups, solidarity groups, they go and they collect them. And so now what they've been doing, they have created, they wash them, they clean them, they take them, and they sell them. So if you want to buy a bag, just go on Lesbos Solidarity. And actually, this is giving work to refugees. And they're hoping that, I've got lots of pictures, and it's great to see it. It's expanding. And, they're now Pikpa is now getting involved in refugee enterprises. They're hoping in Mytilene, where Pikpa is, that they'll soon open a restaurant. They hope also to, make other kinds. And the important thing there is not just for refugees, it's with refugees. And that's the absolutely crucial thing. The enterprises, because the Greek people are on their knees already. They're on their knees economically. The whole country is. So they have to find creative ways of bringing people together so that they don't all turn against each other.
Thank you. And any final questions? Perhaps one last one? Yes, at the front.
Getting back to Greece, and the 60,000 people who are stuck there. This is a tiny number. Mm-hmm. And it is it's not a proper question, but somehow one sees this wonderful humanitarian effort which does go on, lots of volunteers.
Yes.
One sees the sort of blockage and the uncrossable line where the authorities who could do something don't, and are paralysed and are stuck. And somehow if one could find something to pierce through that wall and make the information into a form where the authorities would have to use it, where it would be publicised, and somehow maybe starting with the Greek situation, where the numbers are actually minute. I mean, this isn't even the size of a village, 60,000 people. Can you see any sort of way through where one could publicise that particular situation in such a way that it would permeate into some sort of policy?
It's a great question, and I wish I could. I mean, we're just chipping away. But the solidarity groups in Greece are very, very impressive. They really are. I mean, I agree. I mean, 61,000 is tiny compared to what the numbers in Turkey and Jordan and Lebanon. Or Germany, yes, but the situation is different there in Germany. I mean, it's a bigger country, and the economy is different. The history and politics is different, and many of these people are on small islands. They're located in very specific places, I agree. But look, how many refugees have Britain taken? it's really, really shocking. And this is why I think this, never again, we say never again, but somehow or other, how do we, it is policy, but each and every, and politicians that have to make the big moves, but how do we all as citizens, what is it that we can do to help chip away at, and assume responsibility? Because I suppose it's like it has to come from both sides, doesn't it? I don't know. I mean, there's so many things to be disappointed about, that it's hard to choose your, when you see the homeless people on the streets, and you're constantly thinking, how am I to navigate my way through this? But somehow we have to, because the political situation, I think, is very difficult, and there is a great fear that we see some resurgence of the kind of populist politics and racisms and of the past. And well, the fact that you're here today probably is also good.
Well, I think just to sort of maybe a concluding thought, I think having listened to you today, one of the things that has been very clear to me, at least, is just the overwhelming feeling that this small device, which we're all so familiar with, has transformed the way, so much about the way that the refugee experience works, and yet there's so much that is still the same as in the past.
Yeah.
And that gives us a lot to reflect on, but we also have a lot to sort of get our heads around, because this little device has changed the world forever, and we're still all getting used to it. So it's really been wonderful for me to engage in this conversation and to listen to your talk and hear about your research. So I just want to ask you all to join me in thanking Marie Gillespie for her presentation.
Thank you. Thank you.